Welcome to the Education Innovators Podcast. I'm Eric Byron. This is season 4, and it is my privilege to host this show where I get to talk with thought leaders and experts from all over the world. I'm so glad you're here. Let's get started.
Grades don't matter. Think about the process. We'd all jump on that. But I think it's cultural. It is developing that with students, taking the time to explain to them, your grade is your grade. What matters is how you got there. So if you're not happy with your grade, understand what you can do to improve it. If you are happy with your grade, identify what allowed you to be that successful so that you can keep feeling like that over and over and over again.
Today, we are thinking about thinking with Mr. Metacognition, Nathan Burns. He's joining us today to talk about the importance of developing metacognitive skills and to share the work he's doing with schools to give teachers practical tools that they need to incorporate metacognitive skills development right into their curriculum. Keep listening. Today I have with me Nathan Burns. He is one of the premier experts of metacognition in the UK. Having established himself as an effective classroom practitioner in a number of roles across schools in the East Midlands, primarily as head of maths, Nathan now works full-time in delivering high-quality metacognitive training and change support across educational contexts, both in the UK and worldwide. The author of 3 books on metacognition, with a 4th in the works, Nathan has supported schools and colleges across phases, as well as working in state, private, and international contexts. He delivers staff-facing training, leadership development support, and curriculum development support, overarching metacognitive consultancy. So, welcome to the show, Nathan.
Thank you so much for having me. Very, very excited to be joining you today.
Yeah, so Mr. Metacognition, what a privilege it is to have you on the show. Let's just get started. A little bit of background. I kind of want to figure this out. So you were a math teacher who's now on a mission to help people understand what metacognition is and its importance in education. So my first question is why? What changes when teachers or students better understand metacognition?
So for me, metacognition was something that I sort of started digging into probably about a decade ago. There was sort of an influx of new research in the UK, like I say, sort of around a decade ago, and it really sung to me. It really caught my attention, the potential power that metacognition could have for learners. So I remember sort of reading through this research and thinking, oh, this could be really powerful. This could be, really, really important for supporting our learners and supporting teachers. So it's something that I believe in. And the main reason for that is because of both the research, that's so important. What does the research say we can achieve? But also actually seeing metacognitive practices in schools, actually seeing this research being realized. I mean, it's very easy to see that the research says something that will help our learners, something that will help our teachers, but to actually see the difference that this can have for learners and to see individuals who are developing their metacognitive abilities become better at problem solving and become better at revising and becoming better at being effectively independent and more resilient and able to drive forward their own learning. I think these are all such valuable things, but I don't think any of us would say that we don't want in our students. We all want effective individuals. We want them to be independent. We want them to be able to drive themselves forward. We don't want to be spoon feeding our learners. We don't need to be wanting to wait on them hand and foot. So I think all of those factors just make metacognition such a powerful thing. And like I say, I first sort of came across it in the new wave of research a decade ago and haven't sort of let go of it since.
Okay. Well, let's dig in a little bit here. So I think we need to define what is metacognition because the term has been around for quite a while, right? This isn't new, just some new revelation in the last 10 years. So tell us a little bit about what it is and why, 10 years ago or so, it seems to have gotten a boost in, focus.
Yeah. So like you say, this is not a new idea. I mean, the idea of of metacognition, or this ability to, often people define it as thinking about thinking. We'll get into a sort of a clearer definition in a minute, but this idea of thinking about thinking has been around for hundreds, thousands of years. There are thinkers from the past, Aristotle, Plato, who will have mentioned ideas that sort of draw upon this. In terms of education circles, it really sort of took a step forward in the early 70s. That's when metacognition and education sort of came together, and there was a realization that this is something that occurs widely in education. It's something that we need to develop and work on. But I think what happened in the sort of 40 years after that is there was a lot of terrific research, some really, really good, high quality evidence that this is something that works. But I think an understanding of what that looks like in the classroom and precisely what it was didn't really come about. And I think that's why probably 10 years ago, I know that in the UK, we have the Education Endowment Foundation, the EEF, who sort of assimilated all of this research and produced a very easy to read and an easy to implement guide to metacognition. And I think that's definitely UK side. What really helped us to bring it back into the limelight and give people something tangible to grab onto and implement, because it is I don't want to say airy-fairy idea. That makes it seem like it's not powerful, but it is definitely a more philosophical idea. So in terms of definitions, let's really get into what it is, and people will understand why it can be sometimes seen as quite philosophical. There are lots of definitions out there, and everybody who writes about it or talks about it has their own definition. I have my own. In my first book, I obviously had to make up my own definition, but that's not actually the definition that I use to explain metacognition. So I alluded a minute ago, it's this idea of thinking about thinking, but it's actually so much more than that. The definition that I think helps us most is one from a researcher, theorist, John Flavel, in 1976. And he wrote that metacognition, or I'm being metacognitive if I notice that I'm having more trouble learning A than B. That's the first half of his definition. If I'm having more trouble learning A than B. So that's the idea of, okay, something's not going right. How do I know that it isn't going right? How have I developed an awareness that this isn't how it should look? What is it that I am struggling with? Do I not understand the question? Do I not understand the approach I should be using? Am I struggling to recall the information? And it's that flip of, well, how do I know that I'm doing well? What telltale signs have I got that I'm being successful? What processes have I taken that have allowed me to get to this point? It's that deep interrogation. And I mean, that's why it's meta. It is the evaluation of the cognition, the thinking and the actions and the skills that are demonstrated. And this is the point where I like to give an analogy. That's still quite theoretical. So what would this look like? We're in the classroom and we've just given students a test. Imagine now that we've just given them a 10-mark test. The content doesn't matter. But if we give students that test, there's likely to be a student who scores 10 out of 10. Hopefully the students do really well. They score 10 out of 10. Now that student might go, I'm brilliant. I'm amazing. I've got 10 out of 10. That's fantastic. This is way too easy. Oh, move me up a grade. I need to be stretched. I need to be challenged. Now, unsurprisingly, that isn't metacognition. That isn't a consideration of how something's gone and why it's gone like that. What we really want a student to do, if they've got 10 out of 10, is go, well, that's brilliant. Of course, 10 out of 10 is really good. I couldn't possibly have got more marks. However, what was it that I did that allowed me to be so successful? What approach did I use? What strategies did I deploy? How did I lay my work out? How did I interrogate the question? How did I plan out my response? And therefore, what must I do next time? What are those skills that I want to carry forward? What is the knowledge? What is the learning that I have taken from this? On the flip side, we would maybe have a student who scored 0 out of 10 or 1 out of 10 in that test. They might say, I give up, I'm rubbish, I can't do this. There's no point me carrying this on. Again, that doesn't show resilience, but it also doesn't show metacognitive behaviors. They've just accepted a grade, a score, and determined that they can't do it. A metacognitive response to that would be to go, well, yeah, of course I don't want to get 0. Of course I don't want to get 1. But was there anything that I was close to getting a mark on? Is there something that I could tweak to get 3 or 4, maybe even 5 marks? Did I maybe understand the question, but I couldn't recall the information? Or maybe I could recall the information, but I just wasn't able to decode the questions or the task that I was given. So again, it's that interrogation of not just accepting the grade we got, whether it's good or whether it's less good, but interrogating why that has occurred. And that's the first bit of Flavel's definition. And you can see how, yes, thinking about thinking is a definition that is somewhat helpful, but it's so much more than that. But I think in the world we live in, it's not necessarily more important what Flavel goes on to say, but definitely of equal importance. Because in his definition, he says, yes, if I understand I'm having more trouble learning A than B, but he also goes on to say that if I double check C before accepting it as fact. Now, what he means by that is that in our learning and in our lives, we see patterns, we see models, we draw in connections with previous learning. We make predictions all the time about what we would expect to see. And actually interrogating new knowledge, interrogating a fact we've heard or a video we've seen and going, that doesn't fit in with what I would expect. From an academic perspective, again, if we think about those 10 questions that I've just asked, imagine now we're actually in a maths class and those answers, the first 9 of them, were all positive numbers and they were all positive numbers, and whole numbers. So you got the answer 2 and you got the answer 5 and the answer 7. If for the 10th question, you then got an answer of negative 2.7431, you would probably double check your answer before submitting your work because it doesn't follow the pattern. Now, that interrogation of this doesn't look right. Why don't I think it's right? Well, it doesn't follow the pattern. It's not what I'd expect. Let me interrogate it before submitting the work. Or even the example of this that I'm coming across a lot now, and I'm imagining people will come across this issue more and more and more, is if you're watching a video and in the world we now live in, is that video real or has it been AI generated? Because a couple of years ago, you could watch an AI video and you could tell it was AI because a person would have 5 arms or the snake would be the size of, a tower block. Like it would be farcical. Whereas if you watch an AI generated video now, well, unfortunately, you don't know. You go to the comments section and you're reading through and you're seeing if anybody has noticed anything that suggests it's AI. I mean, I love watching animal videos. That's my big thing. I love scrolling through and watching videos of sharks and orcas and all the like. And when you see them do something amazing, you've got to then spend 10 minutes going through the comments section to go, well, is that real? Has it been AI generated? Has anyone noticed anything? But that process is itself metacognitive. I don't watch something and go, wow, that doesn't seem believable, but I'm going to believe it. I go, I'm not too sure. That almost seems too good to be true. It seems too outside the realm of possibility. Let me interrogate that further. Let me give it a Google. Let me speak to somebody about it and double check that. So that's an additional idea to metacognition. And I think that's something that often gets lost. But in the world we live in now, and we know that AI is prevalent now. How prevalent it's going to be in a few years, it's surely only going to increase. Yes, we may be in a bit of an AI bubble, but I don't think it's going anywhere. So I think that ability to interrogate, to be critical with the knowledge that we hear, and this isn't to say that students should double check everything that we say. We'd never get anywhere. But it is to say that in life, there are things we see or hear which don't quite seem right. And to interrogate, to draw on further evidence, to question is in itself a metacognitive action.
All right. Now, this is really, really good. This is very, very helpful. My brain is abuzz now with all kinds of stuff. But let's talk about, I call it the I don't know what I don't know syndrome,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
There's actually a term for it. It's called the Dunning-Kruger effect.
Yes.
Right? Where literally the less I know, the more confident I am.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the problem we have, right, with AI is that the students can't really challenge the result from AI because they don't know enough to get there.
Yes.
They don't know the right questions to ask.
Yeah.
But it's also this problem with social media and AI, right? If I don't know very much, how do I know enough to challenge something and say, wait a minute, that doesn't make any sense? So how does this building these skills work towards that goal?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a huge problem. You can walk into any education context and students, like you say, will be going through videos, seeing stuff on social media and just believe it. And in many ways, it makes perfect sense. If they've been on this earth for less time than we have and they've seen less, and this is what they're growing up with, well, they are just in that first instance developing their mental models. So if the first video they see on an orca shows it flying through the sky, well, why wouldn't they believe that to be true if you don't have a wider mental model on it? And I mean, I had the same situation a few years ago where I was at basically a UK-based garden, does incredible things, and I, for the first ever time, saw a pineapple growing, and that pineapple was growing out of the ground. And I couldn't believe it. I didn't realize that pineapples grew out of the ground. And it turns out about half of people don't actually know that pineapples grow out of the ground. And I saw it with my own eyes and I couldn't believe it. So I checked with my wife. She told me it was true. I didn't believe her. So I Googled it. But like it happens to others because I'd never seen a pineapple growing. I'd only ever seen them in the supermarket. So there are always points, even in our lives, where it'll be the first time where we're forced to consider something. But we maybe know how to challenge our thinking, like you say. Now, one of the things which I think is really important, and it starts with a very, very simple change in the classroom, and it feeds forward, and the power, I think, can be significant. Now, the idea of, oh, I don't know what I don't know, or the ability to reflect on your own knowledge, we almost have a calibration. It's this judgment of self, and that judgment of self informs how well we think we've done at something or how much we believe that we know. Now, if we consider a school environment, what often happens is a student will answer some questions, they'll do an assessment, they'll do a test, whatever we want to call it. And they will often then have that work marked for them and then given back to them. Now, in that circumstance, it's very easy for the student to go, oh, I knew I was going to get 10 out of 10. I'm amazing on this. Or if the student gets 5 out of 10, they go, oh, well, I didn't really try. I knew that I wasn't going to do particularly well. It's very easy for a student to brush off what they actually did know and equally what they didn't know. We know that students love to do that, right? By not engaging with something, you can, save face. You're not wrong if you don't give it a proper go. Now, what we can do is actually get students to make judgments on their own knowledge and on their outcomes before any marking occurs. So again, let's go back to those 10 quick questions. We could administer that test, that quick fire quiz to our learners. And then we could actually say to them, right, before marking, what I want you to do is I want you just in pencil or on the side of the page to put down how many marks you think you've got. I want you to put a question mark against your answers where you're unsure. I want you to put a tick or a smiley face against the questions that you are most confident against. It's an idea that Patrice Bain mentioned a few years ago when I was working with her, and it works so well at getting students to think about, well, actually, why am I confident with this? Why do I believe I'm correct? We can do it with longer form answers as well. I love doing it when a student goes up to sort of high school, sixth form level, they're 16, 17, 18 years of age. They're answering 30, 40 mark essay type questions. It doesn't have to be just on 1 mark questions. We can give them the mark scheme. We can make sure that they're aware of what they should be doing. And then they can make a judgment. What score do you believe you've got? Where do you think you've lost marks? Where do you think you've done particularly well? And then through the comparison with the mark that they got, but more importantly, with the feedback given to them from their teacher, it allows our learners to begin to calibrate that idea of this is what I do know, and this is what I don't know, and thus what I need to work on. Because that's it. How does a learner, how does a student, whether they're 5 years of age or 50 years of age, how do they drive forward their own learning independently if they don't know what success looks like? So by giving learners the opportunity to calibrate their beliefs about how well they've done and how well they haven't, that then allows them to improve their judgment over time. And I think that feeds forward into a lot of things. If we begin to improve our judgment about the things we do know, if we become more aware of the things that we know that we don't know, because obviously at this point, we have a lot of learners who don't know that they don't know. Well, actually, the important thing is being aware that you don't know. It's not about knowing everything. That's impossible. You could study daily for their whole life and you would know a needle in a haystack amount of knowledge that we know as humankind. It's not about knowing everything. It's about being aware of your strengths, the areas that you are comfortable and confident in, And it's then about knowing what you don't know and being able to address that. And I think that definitely is a foundational concept that can be built in the classroom that ends up supporting some of those AI problems that we've just mentioned.
And sometimes that's just personality almost to some degree, where you have people who are always confident that they're right and some people who don't seem to be confident even when they are the smartest person in the room. All right, let's take a quick commercial break so I can do my usual plug for the human intelligence movement. Not a paid advertisement, I'm just a fan. So the human intelligence movement, they have a mission to ensure that all students have the skills to thrive and succeed in an AI world. You should check it out. I've got a link in the show notes if you're not familiar with the wonderful work that they're doing. All right, now back to my conversation with Nathan Burns as I challenge him a little bit around, how do we get away from dependence on marks and grades? And then, he's going to share some more practical stuff for teachers who want to help students develop metacognitive skills and avoid cognitive overload. All right, we're back.
Yeah, and I think it's so important that we remember both categories of students. It's very easy for us to focus on those learners who are overconfident, who go, oh, I'm going to be correct, I'm always correct, I'm fantastic, of course I'm going to be right, and then subsequently aren't correct or don't get the mark that their confidence suggests they ought to. But actually it is as much a significant problem, those learners who do not recognize their strengths, because that's not effective learning. If that learner is to go and prepare for an exam, prepare for some coursework, whatever it might be, if they are not able to establish what they are good at, they're going to waste an awful amount of time on things that they don't need to be working on. They're going to become stressed over factors that don't matter. They're going to spend time on processes that they've already mastered or mastered sufficiently. So yeah, like you say, it's so important to work with those students. And actually something you've just mentioned, Eric, that jumped me, it's that question of why as well. Not necessarily getting students to justify their answers. Why do you believe that? Why, or not, or almost like, why have you argued that? Like, I disagree with you. But instead saying, okay, where is your evidence from? Why have you used those sources? Would a different source say the same? If you were to read a different article, if you were to read a different research paper, are you going to get that same argument coming through? Is there a contrasting source of evidence? Is there somebody contradicting your claim? So we're not there to sometimes we need to tell students that they're wrong. Sometimes there is an objective, incorrect fact, knowledge recall. But very often, where it's subjective, we don't need to say that they're wrong per se, but actually get them to interrogate their own thought processes. Why have you chosen that argument? What evidence do you have? How strong is that evidence? We know that makes a really good critical academic, that we know that makes really good thinking, but building that process in is really important. Just saying to students, why do you believe that? I'm not saying you're right, I'm not saying you're wrong, I'm not even going to give you my opinion, but why do you believe that? Can you justify that to me? And actually, to begin with, that sets students back. Like, whoa, I've not been asked this before. I just write. Normally, I get feedback on my spelling, punctuation, and grammar, but this time I'm being asked about my sources and why I believe something. And that obviously is really powerful learning-wise, but linking back into AI, knowing that actually getting something from two sources before believing it, and ideally two independent sources, is really quite important. So it builds those further skills as well.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting, but it strikes me that there's a couple of things in here to dig into, but you talk about student identity, right?
Yes.
And how important it is. And I struggle with this because, standardized education, it was really built on the premise that everyone should learn the same things at the same pace.
Yeah.
But when we start talking about student identity and, understanding your strengths and your weaknesses, it almost feels like it's at odds with the system.
Yeah.
So how do we bridge that? How do we allow students to get the time they need in the areas where they're struggling because they're now aware that they're struggling,
Yeah.
or accelerate in the areas where they're confident and they are right. So anyway, talk to me about that and how we do this. You call it student identity.
Yes, and I think very often it seems like a dichotomy, almost like you said. Do we lead the classroom and teach our learners the same thing and work through the curriculum we've devised? Or do we have student-centered learning where learners determine what it is they need to work on next? Now, I'm definitely in the former camp. We need a clear curriculum. We're the experts. We need to be determining that scheme of learning, that progression route. We need to be determining the small steps in learner development. We need to be identifying the correct tasks, the correct homeworking tasks, the right assessments. All of those things are really important. And I'm not an advocate for moving to a system where students determine what lessons and what classes and what topics to take, especially we know that the younger they are, the more of those foundational concepts they need to be building and developing. However, my sort of thinking around this and my understanding of this was revolutionized by an incredible UK-based teacher, Genevieve Bent, has done some incredible work in her London context where she's spoken a lot about learner identity. And she starts by sort of saying that if we spoke to students and we said to them, well, do you see yourself as someone who can learn? Do you see yourself as someone who can achieve? It definitely it sort of rings the bell of growth mindset. Do you believe that you can achieve? But she takes it so much further because research shows us that if we've got learners who don't see themselves as people who can learn, people who can do better, people who academia, whose schooling is for, if they don't see themselves as part of that, they don't do as well. If learners see themselves as an individual who can learn, who can do well, who can get involved, they do better. And this isn't about prior attainment. This isn't about the subjects chosen. This isn't about their prior schooling. This is about outlook and how those individuals see themselves. Now, Genevieve works within a context where there is a clear curriculum, where the expectation in one class is the same as the next, is the same as the next. And she devised some really strong strategies that we can use to sort of develop this learner identity. And the main thing is about giving learners a voice where appropriate. So the best example I can give is imagine now that we've conducted an assessment, we as the teacher have marked it, and we've determined that we want to give the learners some feedback of a feedback lesson, maybe a bit of a reteach. We've noticed a topic that learners have really struggled on. So we're going to take a period and we're going to teach that to them. Where, though, in that process is student autonomy. They've done an assessment and now they're being told what they don't know. That's needed. But there is also space for those learners to self-identify areas they need to work on. So why at the end of an assessment can't we get students to highlight the question that they felt least confident about, the topic area that they're most worried about, and then bring that into that feedback that we're devising? It's really, really important that learners see what they need as something that is being listened to. If we're using exit tickets in the classroom, if we're using mini whiteboards, identifying the topics that students see themselves as struggling on, or if as we're walking around the classroom, there are certain topic areas that students don't have confidence, taking that back and modeling that on the whiteboard, building a bit of a lesson about it. So this isn't about diverting away from the curriculum. This isn't about solely allowing students to determine everything that they do, but building in small but frequent opportunities to listen to students, to engage them in the learning process. And where we're doing a revision lesson, well, we as the expert know really what's important content-wise, but if 90% of our students lack confidence in a given question type, taking time to go over that not just helps the confidence, but shows students that their learning is as much defined by them as it is the teacher. And when it comes to revision, when it comes to assessment preparation, supporting students in developing effective ways of identifying how to revise and what to revise. So working with students about that, we literally talked about 10 minutes ago. It's not about knowing everything. It's about identifying what it is you don't know. So giving students those opportunities to reflect and calibrate actually improves that student identity. Because actually, if we walk into a classroom, how many of our students could tell us what they were learning? How many of our learners could tell us how this links in with other topics? How many of them could tell us what it is they're struggling on? Actually, we're not giving them any level of agency and allowing them to develop that knowledge doesn't derail our lessons. It doesn't mean that we have to move away from teacher-led teaching and learning, but it means that we're empowering basically our students, our learners, to do the right thing at the right time. And the more knowledge they have about how they're learning, what it is they're learning, why they're learning it, and their strengths and their areas for improvement, that is empowering. And that is what helps to generate this learner identity of, well, actually, I can achieve. I know what it is I need to work on, and I know how to work on it. And I know that where the teacher can, they're going to build this into the lesson. And I know that where they can, they're going to give me support in developing a revision program or doing some homework or an after-school intervention. They see me, they listen to me. That all encompasses that idea of student identity. So it's what I'd always say with a lot of changes we're trying to make in the classroom. It's small and it's high frequency. We're not trying to rip everything up and start again. We're trying to build in lots of small little trigger points to build and empower our learners so they see themselves as someone who can learn.
Yeah. So let's go a little controversial here. One of the things that keeps coming up on this show and with guests is the concept that grades or marks are actually destructive, if you will.
Yes.
They're bad for students. They actually do more harm than good because, and in part, the motivation is not the learning. The motivation is the score.
Yes.
Right? I want to get a 10 out of 10. I don't care whether I learned anything. If I have to guess and I guessed correctly and I got a 10 out of 10, bingo. That was the goal.
Yeah.
And so how do we get past that problem with assessment, that the goal becomes the grade, not the learning?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I'm a massive advocate for a grade. Students need to know the map, because what we need to know is, well, where have I got to? And by virtue of that, it's tracking that process. That process, that is the metacognition. What meant that I scored that 8 out of 10? What meant that I got that A grade, that grade 9, whatever it may be? And I think here, this is about systems. This is about culture. If you walk into 10 schools, I would suggest that the majority of them are very focused on their outcomes, on their grades. You can walk into a whole host of schools, and one of the first things they'll tell you about their school are the grades that students get, the grades that learners walk out of their building with at their end of the time with them. And that's great. Some schools will mention how they've developed a rounded student. They'll talk about social development. They'll talk about relationship development. They'll talk about those things. And that is also great. This isn't to say that one thing is better than the other, but it is about culture. Now, unfortunately, it doesn't matter where you are in the world. There is always political pressure for outcomes. So however resilient and however strong you are as a school leader, at the end of the day, your judgment is going to be on grades and it's going to be on outcomes. However, where possible, where we can bear that weight, the focus and the culture needs to be on processes rather than, like we said, the grades. So in a classroom, I give an assessment back and I want students to see the grade, but then I want time built in for students to reflect on, are you happy? Are you not? What allowed you to get that 8 out of 10? What are your strengths? What are you doing really well at? What are you going to do next time? Let's now do some action planning. So the time spent proportionally is far more for reflections on that process versus the grades. And I think it's the trap we always fall into, because our own educations were built upon grades and marks and percentages. That's what our status quo is that. So we've got to keep challenging that on a lesson by lesson basis, on a class by class basis, year group subject basis. It's constantly challenging that culture. And it's not easy. Otherwise, every school would do it. If it was super easy to say grades don't matter, think about the process, we'd all jump on that. But I think it's cultural. It is developing that with students, taking the time to explain to them, your grade is your grade. What matters is how you got there. So if you're not happy with your grade, understand what you can do to improve it. If you are happy with your grade, identify what allowed you to be that successful so that you can keep feeling like that over and over and over again. I often think of the sports analogy. You have a team that's just won a championship, and that the saying goes, isn't it, that you strengthen from a position of power. You've just won the division, you've just won the league. So that's when you get new transfers in. That's when you bring in the next biggest star, because you've just won. So you want to keep getting better. And we've all seen sports teams who go, I've won, take their foot off the gas for a window or whatever it might be. And then the next season, they're right down the league, right? That happens all the time. And that's the same with our learners. It's a brilliant analogy that really helps learners understand that actually it's this, what went well, what allowed me to win, to get that 10 out of 10. Okay, great. So what am I going to do to keep it happening? Because at the end of the day, it does come down to grades. It does come down to those percentages. The end point of every phase in education is a grade on a piece of paper. It always is, and it almost certainly will be. You finish high school, you finish university, you do a master's, whatever it might be, you always end up with a grade or a word, a distinction, a merit, whatever it may be. You're always going to end up with that overall judgment of learning. But that learning process needs to focus on that process. So probably quite a fluffy answer there, but it is cultural, and there is no, if I had an easy solution, then I would be retired on a lovely, sunny, sandy island somewhere, and I'd have fixed all the ills of education. But many incredible thinkers, like you said, mention the same. Week in, week out on the podcast, people be saying the same. It's not easy, but it is so very important that we keep trying to push in that direction, at least. We may never quite get there, but it's the movement in that direction which matters.
Yeah. So first of all, I just want to say I am a huge fan of assessment and feedback.
Yes.
I just don't like a letter grade or a mark.
Yeah.
So I think that it makes us compare ourselves to other students. Absolutely. And, you know, I'm sure you're familiar with the work. The book is called Punished by Rewards, right? Yeah. That even in the workplace, right, we have the same problem. I don't get, grades. You don't get a grade in the office, right, for your job, but you get feedback, right?
Yeah.
And so the model in schools doesn't really fit the rest of society. It's its own kind of culture that's been built around this. And I personally believe that we're kind of stuck with it because it gives the schools what they need, not the students. Right? Yeah. It works for the school. It doesn't necessarily work for the student. But I'll just really quick, I'll draw one analogy to this and feedback. One of the reasons why I really like game-based learning is because when you play a game, there's no grade, but you get constant feedback on your progress, right? You can see where you're being successful and you can see where you're not, right? Yes. It's a constant loop. And this is what, it's designed intentionally into a good game that you're constantly getting feedback and acknowledged, rewarded, right? You see when you're successful, when you're successful, when you're not, right? And so I think that education needs to model this better. Not necessarily every education has to be a game, but that concept that it's not a summative assessment that's the goal. It's the constant feedback all along that says you are learning something and you are progressing, and it's not about the grade at the end of the term. It's about what you learned as you went. So anyway, I kind of challenge your assumption that grades will always be there and that this system will always work off of grades. I hope not.
I'd agree. I hope it doesn't sort of remain the status quo. I think I was listening to another podcast recently, and they said something very similar to you, that it works for schools, and it's easy. It is an easy thing to do. It is easy to do an end of year or an end of phase assessment and to determine a grade and to allow judgment of classes, subjects, learners, schools, districts. It is an easy way to do it. But it's quite interesting you mentioned sort of games, because one of the things that I've worked on with a lot of schools in the last year is around developing independence. How do we get our learners to be more independent? And it's very, very much the same. So I often talk about almost like outcome-free activities. And what I mean by that is, instead of asking students a question and getting them to respond to it, actually giving them a context or giving them a set of information, saying, well, learners, students, tell me what the question could have been. Give me as many questions as you think are appropriate. Set me some really difficult ones that I'm going to do on the board and model to you in a minute. Or even context problems where students get given graphs or images or lengthy text that sets up a mathematical problem. At the end of that, there's always a question. We'll get rid of it. And actually, Let students play with that information. Well, what do you know? Now you've looked at that image. What are all of the things that you can tell me that you know? And what we're trying to do is remove barriers to accessing that work. And it's high ceiling. It gives students the opportunities to keep reflecting on what they do know, to show off what it is they are capable of. And yes, all of that builds independence, but it also focuses on this idea of process rather than absolute outcomes, like you mentioned.
Yeah. All right, let's shift gears a little bit. We could talk about this all day, I can tell.
Yeah.
But I want to talk about cognitive overload.
Yes.
So, and how this training that you do for both kind of teachers and students on metacognition, how do you treat that topic, right? Because we all know that, beyond 10 minutes, right? And I worry about this with my podcast, right? It ends up being almost an hour long. How many people just after 10 minutes go, I can't process anymore, right? My brain is full. So talk to me about cognitive overload and how you address that in your training.
Absolutely. So I think the key thing for me is when we're in the classroom and we're trying to develop metacognition. So that can look like lots of different things. It might be the way that we model to students, explaining our own thinking. It might be the tasks that we use that give learners opportunities to monitor their progress, track against targets. It might be the opportunities that we give for students to access and activate the feedback that we've been given. And I think what you've just mentioned, that avoiding overload, that 10 minutes, this is about short, sharp chunks. This isn't about doing everything at once. In an ideal world, students would plan out their work perfectly. They consider exactly what the question is asking them to do, exactly the best way of doing it. They'd consider the knowledge they have and they don't have and what they need to learn. They'd monitor as they move through. They'd have a checklist. They'd check answers as they go through. They'd use scaffolds and adaptations to work with them. And they'd evaluate at the end. They'd feed forward. There's a lot. That's my point. There's a lot. We can't possibly do all of those things at any given point. It's going to overwhelm us as educators trying to develop these skills and characteristics in our learners. And boy, oh boy, it's just going to be way, way too much for our learners. And so I always suggest that as a classroom teacher, when you're going into your lesson, you've got your cognitive aims. I want students to know this. I want students to be able to do this. Just adding in a small metacognitive element that you want to develop in that lesson. So, for example, you might be aware that in your own modeling, you're focusing on certain keywords in the question because you know that those are the words that are always used in the exam, or they're words that are used in future topics. So explaining that to students, I want you all to be aware the reason I'm focusing on this vocabulary is because it always appears here or because it's always there. That would be one thing we could do. Or you might reflect and potentially you're doing source interrogation or something like that in your lesson. And what you might say is, right, the metacognitive aim I have for this lesson is to get students to answer the why question. Why have you determined that? Why have you used that source of information? Or it might be that you want students to activate their feedback, so you give them a bit of an opportunity to pre-mark and pre-evaluate before they've actually got the marks back or the grade back that they're able to calibrate. So it's about choosing the thing that is suitable for that lesson rather than trying to do it all. So given the content of that, because it is at the end of the day, metacognition, the meta aspects link in with the cognition. And every time we change topics and change activities, the meta that we're trying to work on is of course going to change. And so identifying the most important metacognitive thing that we want to draw attention to or give students the opportunity to work on, to develop, that's what's important. So I always think about, well, we do small steps in our teaching. Right, let's all know how to do this. Okay, good, we've got it. Now let's add on this aspect. Okay, good. And we, step 3, step 4, step 5, we practice each one. It's the same metacognition-wise. Just because there is all of this stuff that we want students to be good at doesn't mean we try and do it all at once. We don't start teaching students how to read when they're 4 and 5 and then say, here is the full, here is War and Peace, here is this, here is that. Work it all out. We build and we build and we build. Metacognition-wise, we don't go to a 4-year-old, well, why are you not considering the feedback I've given you? And why are you not pushing that feedback forward into... A 4-year-old would just look at you with a blank face. So it's about building these things over time, identifying the metacognitive element that you would like to develop, for the content that you're teaching, supports. There's no point shoehorning something in. I often talk about planning templates. They can be a really good way of developing metacognitive thought. But if you're doing a practical sports lesson, or you're working with 4 and 5-year-olds who don't yet know how to write, then a written template is not the way to go. So don't try and shoehorn it in. Bring in the element, the idea that suits that and allows you to reflect on your own metacognition as an expert. So yeah, small steps, identifying those things that really matter. And I think that goes a long way very quickly to supporting that cognitive load. And as soon as educators give themselves that space to develop things slowly but surely, it becomes a lot easier than going, I've heard this podcast, Metacognition Matters, I've got to go and do it. No, it takes time. We are still developing our metacognition now as adults, as learners of many years. So the students we're working with need that opportunity as well to develop it over time.
Yeah. So I'm having a little bit of cognitive overload myself at this point. So if I'm a teacher out there who's listening to this episode now and going, okay, I get it, I should start to incorporate more metacognitive exercises into stuff, where do they start? Where do you begin? Where do you find the information on how to do this?
So I have one go-to thing that everybody can do from day dot. You can listen to this, and the next minute you're in the classroom, you can do it. And it's around classroom modeling. We do it every single lesson. We're stood at the front of the room. We've got all of our learners there. We are modeling every single lesson, whether on a whole class basis, in groups, one-to-one with students. We're always teaching students new concepts and new ideas. And we are at the front of the room for a reason. We are the experts. We've studied the subject for far longer and far greater depth. So I say this to anyone modeling, to anyone teaching. When you are teaching students a concept, if you are making a decision, maybe over the word that you focus on, the example that you're using, the strategy that you're deploying, the layout, whatever it might be, whenever you're making a decision in your modeling that is based upon your expertise, if it's obvious to your learners, then that's great. That's fine. You don't need to mention it. But if you are making a decision that is because you're an expert and your learners wouldn't be aware of that, then that is the metacognitive gap. And that is something that we can just verbally explain. The reason why I've highlighted this word is because it's the key command word and I need to keep coming back to it. The reason why I am laying out my answer like this is to ensure that I remember all of the points that I need to include because it's a multi-step problem and I don't want to forget them. Just small little snippets to explain. And that seems quite academic. I always give an example of food technology. The reason why I'm getting the long knife is so that I can do one clean cut through the fruit and the veg. I don't want to take a small knife because I risk cutting myself. Just little explanations, things that we know because we are experts. That is my go-to thing. You don't need to prepare hugely. There's no resources, there's no printouts, and there are opportunities to develop that in small chunks every single lesson. We can't go through a lesson without modeling an idea or a concept to our learners. So it's something that we can start out low sort of barriers of us doing it, and we can keep practicing lesson after lesson, day after day. That's my go-to, my one takeaway would be for teachers to work on that.
Yeah, that's great. It actually reminds me of, so in the workplace, I worked a lot over the years with engineers, right?
Yeah.
And we always used to want to put an expert with the new guy, right?
Yeah.
Coming in because the expert could answer their questions, kind of help them get up to speed. But we often realized that the expert is so expert sometimes that they don't know how to articulate it to somebody who doesn't know what they know. Right?
Absolutely.
There's so many steps that they just skip in their head because it's so obvious to them. And so when they give instructions to a new person, it's like they're speaking Greek. and yes, anyway, sometimes the experts aren't actually the best at explaining things to a novice because it's hard for them to even realize, how much stuff I just take for granted because it seems so obvious to me. So yes, being an expert doesn't necessarily make you a good teacher.
It brings its own challenges, and I think that's it. However expert we think ourselves, we're always going to be more expert than our learners. So thinking about those things that we know and those automatic things that we do, and illuminating them for our learners. That's that metacognitive gap. And that's the perfect analogy, actually. The very best expert engineer in the world is maybe not always the best person to teach that new novice engineer and go for all the small steps, because everything's automatic to them. All of these basics are automatic because that's what's making them an expert. So yeah, absolutely fantastic analogy.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, anything else you want to add? Anything we didn't cover that you think I should have asked?
I'm really happy with that. I think we've got into some really, really deep and really good points. It was nice to really get into the nitty gritty of some of those ideas, which isn't always the case. So yeah, no, really happy with that.
Yes. All right. Well, Nathan, thank you so much for being on the show and, talking to me about metacognition. And I agree. It's important.
Amazing. No, really, really appreciate you having me. That's been a really genuinely good, deep conversation. I've loved it. Thank you so much.
All right. Now we know why Nathan Burns earned the name Mr. Metacognition. He is passionate about helping students understand what they struggle with and why they struggle with it and what they can do to improve. Literally getting students to think about thinking and to challenge new information. Of course, in today's world, we have to verify and validate that the things we see online or output from AI are true. If you're enjoying this podcast, and I sincerely hope that you are, please subscribe and share. We're just getting towards the end of season 4 already, and I've already got an amazing list of guests lined up for season 5. It's going to be so exciting. The learning never stops. All right, I'm Eric Byron. Thanks for listening to the Education Innovators Podcast, and to all those education innovators out there, you are making a difference.